Good day. I am Cherilyn Bigandilan and I will be discussing to you today Peter Singer Practical Ethics in 1979 and its key concept that includes the animal rights, abortion, euthanasia or the infanticides, and the environmental ethics. Peter Singer Practical Ethics in 1979 is a guidebook for making good choices in a world full of moral questions. He uses utilitarianism to figure out what's right in making decisions that lead to the greater good for the greatest number of happiness and the least amount of pain or suffering for the most people. In simple words, choosing actions that create most happiness and reduce suffering for the most people. The second one is the equal consideration of interest. It is the equal consideration to all beings that is capable of sufferings like us, humans and animals, that can feel pain. So their suffering should be considered equally when we make moral decision. And the third one is a practical application. That is, Singer applies this principle to a variety of real world issues or challenging conventional ethical beliefs and proposing practical solution. The book examines a wide range of ethical issues, including the animal rights, euthanasia and infanticide, abortion, environmental ethics, and the global poverty. Peter Singer, Animal Rights, challenges the traditional view that humans are morally superior to animals, arguing that we should extend equal consideration to all beings capable of suffering. He advocates for vegetarianism and criticizes factory farming practices as morally wrong. For instance, in factory farming like poultry farms, dairy farms, and aquaculture, animals like pigs, cows, or chickens and other animals endure significant suffering. According to Peter Singer, animals often face various forms of treatment and conditions. Their suffering should be taken seriously, just as we would for humans. He advocates vegetarianism, which involves care for animals, and criticizes factory farming practices as morally wrong. He thinks that we shouldn't eat meat or use animals for experiments because it causes them pain. Like this. The picture shows that the animals endure significant suffering, that animals often face various forms of treatment and conditions. That is, accordingly to Peter Singer's, this is morally wrong. Now, euthanasia and infanticide is under the bioethics or healthcare that addresses issues related to patients' autonomy. Euthanasia and infanticide is refers to the practice of intentionally ending a life to relieve pain and suffering. And there are two forms of euthanasia, which is the voluntary and the non-voluntary euthanasia. Voluntary euthanasia is that the fulfilling, the explicitity, and the repeated uttered and traditional wish of a person to be killed. Person with terminal illness can choose to end their lives, to end their suffering with the help of a medical professional. For Singer, it is morally justified because individuals have the right to choose how they die, particularly in the face of terminal illness and suffering. This leads to increased happiness and well-being both for individuals choosing death and for their loved ones who might be burdened by the witnessing their suffering. So that is the voluntary euthanasia. An example of voluntary euthanasia is that when an individual, or let's say Sarah, is diagnosed with terminal illness that causes her pain and suffering. Despite of the treatment, her condition become worsen and worse. Sarah understands that the situation and expresses a strong desire to end her suffering. She believed that continuing to live in such a state is no longer a good life for her. So to minimize suffering and lead to increased well-being for both individual choosing death and for their loved ones who might be burdened by witnessing their suffering. So Peter Singer euthanasia or the voluntary euthanasia is not universally accepted because for many, especially in religious belief, life is sacred and precious. And for Peter Singer, he considered the quality of life of the individual. Now, the non-voluntary euthanasia is where the person concerned is not able to give consent to her being killed, as she is in the state of mind where she cannot even grasp the meaning of life and death decision, wherein he argues that in some cases might be better to serve ending their lives by considering the potential of suffering, burden on the family who might be forced to witness their child prolonged suffering. He argued that each case need to be evaluated on its own merits and consider individual potential for future suffering. Here in the non-voluntary euthanasia, Peter Singer mainly in respect to the handicap of infants. For example, a newborn infant is diagnosed in a condition where the brain is missing or incomplete. The infant is likely to die within the short time, and the process may be accompanied by the significant pain or suffering. Remember that Peter Singer non-voluntary euthanasia is not an endorsement, it is an ongoing debate. He believed that it's not justified to kill newborn, but in the case of a diagnosed newborn, killing would be correct and morally right. Abortion and euthanasia are interconnectedness. Peter Singer examined the morality of abortion, arguing that the moral status of fetus should be determined by its capacity to experience pleasure and pain, rather than its stage and development. He does not believe that abortion is always ethical. Always remember that. While he supports women's right to choose and argues that abortion is morally permissible before the fetus develops. He acknowledged that there are other factors to consider, and he might consider abortion morally wrong in certain circumstances. It is morally right or moral when the fetus is without sentience, doesn't possess the same moral status as a person with a capacity to experience pain and pleasure. Abortion can be morally justified when it minimizes suffering for the woman and potentially for the fetus in severe disability. It is morally wrong when the fetus is variable that can survive outside the womb, the woman's decision is not fully informed, and the woman decision is motivated by the factors and are not in the best interest. On the global poverty, Peter Singer argued that we have moral obligation to help those in needs to alleviate poverty and suffering in developing countries. And in environmental ethics, Peter Singer explored the ethical implication of human interaction with the environment, including biodiversity, conservation, climate change, and the use of the natural resources. He argued that we have an obligation to protect environment for the future generation. And that will be all. Thank you for listening.